Well, of course, there wasn't wisdom, but what there was a strategy. And the strategy in Ukraine is the identical strategy thought up by Mr. Brzezinski 25 years ago in Afghanistan. Brzezinski was the strategist for Jimmy Carter and convinced Jimmy Carter to say, look, the Russians are dominating Afghanistan with a civilian, secular government. Let's create a new organization. Let's create al-Qaeda. Let's back Osama bin Laden and give his supporters weapons to begin fighting the Russians. And we can pull a coup d'etat there. And the Russians will fight back, and then we'll say the Russians invaded. And it worked. Saudi Arabia made a deal with America that they would push the Wahhabi extremists, the al-Qaeda, the most right-wing wing of the Islamic parties, and it worked. Essentially, al-Qaeda is a contract army for the United States. Well, the same thing was happening in Russia. What Brzezinski wrote was that America's faced with a possibility of not being able to rule the world unilaterally. And that would be a disaster for democracy. That we can't let any country's economic ability to be self-sufficient means potential military power. And in order to prevent any country from threatening America militarily, you have to prevent it from developing economically. The American nightmare, Brzezinski wrote, was that Russia would get together with Germany and with Western Europe, creating Russian raw materials, German industry, and somehow, finally, Russia would become westernized. America, under Brzezinski's strategy, said this would be a disaster because if Russia's westernized, if it becomes democratic, if Europe and Russia are prosperous, then we cannot control them anymore, and they will have no reason to be NATO. We've got to stop Russia, and the place to stop this Russian-European conglomeration is to split it right at the border down Ukraine. Let's do in Ukraine what we did in Afghanistan. Let's back the crazies. Well, most of them are the former neo-Nazi groups that have been so prominent that fly the Nazi flags.
I don't want to present this idea of there being this kind of simplistic dichotomy in Ukraine between a kind of fascist force which has come into power against Russian military forces, thugs. I mean, all sorts of terms such as this have been used, pejorative terminology. It's more complicated. The Maidan was a very pluralistic movement. It contained left elements, centrist elements, hard right-wing elements. It's quite true, as both James and Michael have said, that the United States decided that it was going to pick winners. Now, this is something that the United States instructs or tells its client states in East Europe that they must never do with their economies. They're not allowed to help develop industries and pick winners. That would be bad. That would not allow the market to take place. But when it comes to politics, they're never going to allow the political market to operate. In other words, real democracy, and for the people to really determine what it is that they want. And so we see this picking of winners, in fact, by the United States. So what we've seen, unfortunately, is a situation in which the wishes of the people of Ukraine, for the most part, have been largely ignored.
This is exactly what happened in Russia after 1991. Russia essentially dismantled its manufacturing and its industry under World Bank and IMF tutelage. There were a number of American economists, Nobel Prize winners, who urged Russia to base its economy on natural resource rent and land rent, and not on taxing industry. And essentially, they proposed that Russia become a social democratic country like America is. In America, the government subsidizes technology, industry, and helps develop, but that wasn't the way that Russia went. In Russia, the Baltics, the post-Soviet states, they're not mixed economies. They're all privatized, and because they're privatized, they essentially are torn apart and have emigration. I think Latvia and the Baltics were probably a kind of laboratory. How can you convince a population voluntarily to lower its living standards, to have its young adult males that are educated and trained move to foreign countries and still vote for the neoliberals? And the answer is, as long as you can make the elections about hating the other side, about hating the Russians, about resenting the past injustices of Stalinism, then they're more concerned with their hatreds and the past than they are with developing themselves.